My name is Dan Smith. I was a professor of history at the University of Kentucky for about 30 years. Taught early American history. I'm also a filmmaker, and I did the film. In fact, in an exercise that's kind of the opposite of the way you're supposed to do it. I was the screenwriter for the Rich-Heape film on the Trail of Tears, and James Earl Jones and Wes Studi narrated a few years ago. And now I'm writing the book, rather than doing it the other way around. I'm writing a book, and I finished it actually, and Henry Holt will be publishing it next spring, early next summer. Pretty much along the lines of what I'm going to talk about today. It's called Cherokee Patriots and the Trail of Tears. So I hope you'll bear with what I'm doing today, which is, in a way, sharing some thoughts and direct quotes in many cases. So I'll be doing more quoting than maybe you're used to. I'm not going to do it with interrupting phrases like quote unquote or using air quotes. I'm going to try to use the intonation of my voice so you'll know, hopefully, when I'm quoting someone rather than talking in my own voice about it. But I thought that the issue of patriotism is central and somewhat unstudied or not so much commented on in the Trail of Tears experience. Arguably the most tragic interracial event in American history, Trail of Tears, has sometimes been called an American Holocaust or genocide. It was neither. No one wanted, let alone planned for, Cherokees to die in the forced removal out west. But it did dramatize not only the loss of sacred lands in the southeast, but also the failure of democracy and justice for an entire people, ironically the most civilized tribe. Few stories from the American past reveal in such devastating terms the consequences of unchecked greed and racial oppression. The Cherokees were hardly the only Indians to experience the pain and loss of forced removal. Dozens of other tribes in the U.S. underwent similar suffering, but because of the Cherokees' unique accomplishments as a well-educated people, we have come to view their anguish as emblematic for all native peoples who faced forced removal in the 1830s. Few tribes had so fully accepted the promise of democracy as the Cherokees. After all, their 1827 Constitution was modeled after the U.S. Constitution. So in some ways, the principal tragedy of the Trail of Tears lies in the heart-wrenching treachery they felt at the hands of the United States. Most accounts of this powerful story focus on the easily identifiable villains, victims, and heroes. From the Indian fighting Andrew Jackson to his land-hungry Southern white co-conspirators, the villains are easy to spot. The Cherokees themselves are often depicted as hopelessly naive in their belief that, thanks to their successful embrace of a civilized life, they would be spared from the relentless determination among white leaders and settlers to take over Indian lands in the southeast. Center stage as the main protagonist in this traditional account is Chief John Ross for his laudable, tenacious struggle to save the homeland and keep the nation together. Such a narrative is accurate as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. A fuller perspective on the Trail of Tears takes us into the minds and hearts of those Cherokees who fought each other just as fiercely as they took on Andrew Jackson over what they saw as the very soul of the Cherokee people. What they were fighting over in Cherokee country and beyond in the 1820s and 30s was nothing less than what it meant to be a good Cherokee, a patriot, amid the critical struggle over removal. The removal crisis plunged the Cherokees into a profound and sometimes violent quarrel over the issue of patriotism. From the 1820s on, a series of painfully difficult questions haunted the Cherokee people. Was it possible for a Cherokee to be a full citizen of the American nation and yet remain connected to tribal traditions and ancestral land? Given the obvious hunger among Southern whites for Indian land, should Cherokees have placed their hopes on assimilation in their homeland or the independence of the Cherokee nation, regardless of geography? What could a patriotic Cherokee do to save his people if the only choices were clinging to a homeland that white settlers were bent on overrunning or recreating the nation in a distant land? In short, if you could not save both your homeland and your people, which one mattered most? Which one could you possibly surrender? And what made you the more faithful Cherokee, the more loyal patriot, fighting to save your home or to save your people? Beginning in the 1790s, some Cherokees attempted to answer these questions by following the lead of those white politicians from the Washington administration who insisted they become civilized and adopt Anglo ways. By assimilating into enlightened white culture and its notions of private property, commercial agriculture, they could prove their worth as red citizens of the American Republic and maintain their presence in their ancestral homeland. But as Elias Boudinot and John Ridge so bitterly discovered, even well-educated, sophisticated Cherokees who did everything right that white Americans expected could not escape racism. And the relentless intrusion of white settlers into Indian country, aided and abetted by Andrew Jackson, as president, revealed that soon, very soon, the Cherokee people would have to surrender something fundamental, either the land they had lived on for thousands of years or their very identity as Cherokees living under their own sovereign government. By the summer of 1832, a full-blown split emerged in Cherokee country over what had become known as the Cherokee question. Not only how to respond to the obvious lack of support for the Cherokees from the federal government, as well as Georgia's continuing encroachments, but also how to deal with growing divisions within the Cherokee Nation itself. On one side stood Chief John Ross, who insisted the Cherokees must remain in their homeland at all costs, that removal must be resisted, and that anyone who endorsed, let alone participated in negotiating a removal treaty was, in effect, a traitor, an enemy to his people. The great majority of the Cherokees, intent on keeping their homeland, supported Ross's unrelenting stance of resistance to removal. A smaller but highly vocal portion of the Cherokee people, though, had come to believe that removal represented the only alternative to the nation's eventual degradation at the hands of what Elias Boudinot called an overwhelming white population, who, in their sovereign pleasure, consider the Cherokees as their inferiors. Boudinot, John, and Major Ridge, along with David Vann and a few other acculturated Cherokee leaders, comprised the leadership of what became known as the Treaty Party, because of their willingness to negotiate a treaty to immigrate to new lands out west, where they believed the Cherokees had the best chance to survive as a people. In that summer of 1832, an escalating war of words, grounded in the fierce convictions of both parties, swirled throughout Cherokee Nation. Initially, the conflict pitted a wealthy, slave-owning, acculturated principal chief against an outspoken newspaper editor filled with missionary zeal. What they fought over was nothing less than the destiny of the Cherokee people. And much of that debate turned on the question, at this critical moment, what should a good patriot do for his people? Chief John Ross and Elias Boudinot answered that question in wildly different, contradictory ways. Portraying himself as the steadfast protector of the homeland, Ross argued that members of the Treaty Party were a small minority opposed to the will of the people, who were attempting to sell out their sacred homeland without the authority to do so, and against the people's expressed injunctions. Boudinot bitterly fought back against the elusive appearance of having a vast majority opposed to us. The only reason the Cherokee people sided with Ross, Boudinot insisted, was because their chief had not seen fit to speak honestly with them about the grave dangers that lay ahead if they resisted removal. We charge Mr. Ross, Boudinot wrote, with having deluded them with expectations incompatible with and injurious to their interest. According to Boudinot, Ross was preventing discussion and debate of this vital matter, leaving his people ignorant of their true condition. Truthful information, Boudinot fiercely believed, would lead his people to a wise decision. He was firmly of the opinion that a large majority of the Cherokee people would prefer to remove if the true state of their condition was properly made known to them. Boudinot also lashed out at Ross's claim that somehow the pro-removal forces were to blame for the internal divisions within the Cherokee Nation, arguing that in fact it was the Treaty Party that had sounded the alarm to save the nation by timely action. Boudinot and his friends had been the true friends of the Cherokee people, desperately seeking answers and a new strategy. We asked, we entreated, we implored, but we were met at the very threshold as enemies of our country. Boudinot did not hesitate to use his position as editor of the Cherokee Phoenix to openly debate the issue, but Ross, who viewed the newspaper as the official organ of the Cherokee Nation, would not tolerate such dissent. The Phoenix, Ross contended, should present only the positions voiced by the constituted authorities of the Cherokee people. The toleration of diversified views to the columns of such a paper could not fail to create fermentation and confusion among our citizens, Ross declared, and in the end prove injurious to the welfare of the nation. The love of our country and people demands unity of sentiment and action for the good of all. Clearly fearing that white political leaders might look upon such public quarreling as an expression of weakness in the struggle to resist removal, Ross instructed Boudinot in July to stop publishing dissenting opinions in the paper. Outraged at Ross's act of censorship on such a crucial matter, Boudinot resigned as editor of the Phoenix on August 1st. To stay on as editor, Boudinot declared in his final editorial, would put him in as embarrassing as it would be peculiar and delicate situation. Seeing his position as a moral imperative, he put the matter in the starkest terms. I do conscientiously believe it to be the duty of every citizen to reflect upon the dangers with which we are surrounded, to view the darkness which seems to lie before our people, our prospects and the evils with which we are threatened, to talk over all these matters. Only a free and friendly discussion among ourselves will lead to a clear sense of the will of the people, Boudinot argued. It is presenting the serious and momentous things to the people, what I mean by telling them the truth. And I am inclined to believe that it is the best, if not the only way to find out what the will of the people is. What are our hopes and prospects? What are our dangers and difficulties? When Boudinot departed the Phoenix, Ross still needed the paper to spread his anti-removal message, so he replaced Boudinot with his brother-in-law, Elijah Hicks. Hicks wasted no time vilifying his predecessor. He promptly announced that Boudinot's resignation represented a loss that was but a drop in the bucket. After all, Hicks claimed Boudinot had become detached from the nation and was now no more a patriot. By questioning Boudinot's patriotism, Hicks had deliberately pushed a very hot button. I am not detached from, but attached to the nation, Boudinot fired back. There is nothing in my letter of resignation or in my explanations, Boudinot insisted, which shows a want of patriotic views and motives. My motives were certainly of the most patriotic kind. In one word, I may say that my patriotism consists in the love of the country and the love of the people. These are intimately connected, yet they are not altogether inseparable, which was precisely the case, he argued, in the decision facing the Cherokees. If the country is lost, or is likely to be lost to all human appearance, and the people still exist, may I not, with a patriotism true and commendable, make a question for the safety of the remaining object of my affection? Boudinot's position could not have been plainer. The Cherokee people were facing a devastating loss. Better to relocate where they can survive as a people than stubbornly resist the inevitable and lose both their land and their soul. Our lands, or a large portion of them, are about to be seized and taken from us, he wrote. Now, as a friend of my people, I cannot say peace, peace, when there is no peace. I cannot ease their minds with any expectation of a calm when the vessel is already tossed to and fro and threatened to be shattered to pieces by an approaching tempest. The way he saw it, the Cherokees now faced a grim existential decision that held out the three choices: stay and fight for their lands against overwhelming odds, submit to an oppressive white population and suffer a moral death, or avoid the first two by removal. In addition to Major John Rich, among the leading Cherokees joining Boudinot's treaty party included his brother Stan Waddy, William Cootie, a nephew of John Ross, William Hicks, John Walker Jr., David Vann, John Fields, William Rogers, and James Starr. The treaty party probably never represented more than 10% of the people and their chiefs, and an even smaller fraction of the more traditional elements in the nation. So with the majority of Cherokees remaining strongly attached to their homeland, Boudinot understood he was fighting an uphill battle. Such a battle, he reasoned, required facing a harsh reality. And for Boudinot, that reality pointed to but one question left to us and to every Cherokee: whether it is more desirable to remain here with all the embarrassments with which we must be surrounded, or to seek a country where we may enjoy our own laws and live under our own vine and fig tree. Patriotism was a noble thing, Boudinot conceded, but how was one to love one's country that was destined for destruction? Although we love the land of our fathers, he argued, we consider the lot of the exile immeasurably more to be preferred than a submission to oppressive laws and the inevitable ruin and degradation of the Cherokee people. Boudinot's challenge then to Ross ran deeper than simply speculating on the likely outcome of removal. An ardent Christian, Boudinot's convictions about the fate of his people were inextricably linked to highly moral values, values planted and nurtured as a young man when he was under the influence of white evangelicals, mainly up in New England. Since leaving Cornwall, Boudinot had been consumed with the idea that the Cherokee self-advancement hinged not simply on material progress, but on spiritual and moral improvement as well. So he was especially irked that Ross seemed to suggest that prior to being despoiled by their guardian, the Cherokees lived in prosperity and happiness, and that somehow the treaty advocates were now responsible for ruining that bucolic world. Have we indeed been the instruments of despoiling our nation? Have we destroyed their happiness, checked their civilization, and corrupted their morals? Ross's rosy view of the Cherokee people, Boudinot contended, especially as it involves whites intermarried among us and their descendants, might be accurate. But most Cherokees, he believed, were suffering from everything from alcoholism to poverty to spiritual and moral despair. If Ross and his supporters would honestly face the truth about the moral condition of the Cherokees, they would discover a people desperately in need of a new start. Look at the mass and look at the entire population as it now is, and say, can you see any indication of a progressing improvement, anything that can encourage a philanthropist? You know that it is almost a dreary waste. I care not if I am accounted a slanderer of my country's reputation. Every observing man in the nation knows that I speak the words of truth and soberness. Ross's truth, from Boudinot's perspective, focused only on the economic condition of his people rather than its character and morals, the soul of the nation. Thus Ross was preoccupied with the value of the lands, mountains, and forests they would be surrendering. Ross's fixation on the physical assets of the Cherokee nation blinded him to more important realities. Perish your gold mines and your money, Boudinot charged, if in the pursuit of them the moral credit of this people, their happiness and their existence are to be sacrificed. To Boudinot and the Ridges remaining on the homeland not only denied their inevitable fate of forcible removal by the U.S. military, it also flew in the face of a powerful moral imperative that the Cherokee people, left surrounded by the debasing elements of white culture, confronted a future full of degradation and immorality. Boudinot seized on the spread of intemperance and the wretchedness and misery already in evidence. You will find an argument in every tippling shop in the country. You will find its cruel effects in the bloody tragedies that are frequently occurring, in the frequent convictions and executions for murders, and in the tears and groans of the widows and fatherless, rendered homeless, naked, and hungry. A genuine patriot, claimed Boudinot, seeks to save his people's soul, not simply its land. And so for him and the Ridges, that meant resettling out west where the Cherokee people could reconstitute themselves in a virtuous and prosperous nation. Among the ironies of this devastating choice hanging over the Cherokee people was that it took the, quote, civilization program to reveal to the young and sophisticated Boudinot and Ridge that their people's future lay in establishing independence from, not assimilation into, American society. Much of what they had valued, their faith, friends, spouses, and education, came from white culture. And yet they came to believe that whites were destroying their race through a violent land grab and moral degeneracy sparked by greed, immorality, and spread of alcohol. To Boudinot and the Ridges, the Cherokee people faced not simply the threat of losing their homeland, but the loss of their own independent culture. From their perspective then, there was no time to lose. You must not remain longer in contact with the whites, Boudinot told his people. Your safety lies in isolation. Yet another irony was that in choosing removal, Boudinot and Ridge were putting important distance between themselves and their missionary friends, who had done so much for the Cherokee cause. Samuel Worcester, perhaps Boudinot's closest white friend, believed, like John Ross, that the Treaty of New Echota was a mistake, and signing it was, at best, misguided. Despite his fondness and respect for Boudinot, Worcester described the treaty as a fraudulent and wicked transaction, though he felt Boudinot was conscientious in the part he acted. Likewise, the Reverend Daniel Buttrick criticized Boudinot for his position on the treaty, and in 1839 pleaded with him to apologize for his error in advocating removal. Boudinot and the Ridges found themselves opposed by the missionaries during the removal crisis, and indeed by most Cherokees. Ironically, they were seen as aligned with the U.S. government, with whom they had fought for so long. If Boudinot and the Ridges relentlessly pursued the Patriot call for removal out west, where, they believed, moral renewal could be accomplished, Ross and the mass of the Cherokee people focused exclusively on protecting the homeland as the critical work of the true patriot. When he was not attacking the treaty party for its traitorous conduct, Ross tirelessly fought to find a way for his people to remain in their homes, to publicize the unfair plight of the Cherokees, and in the end, to negotiate better financial terms for removal once it came. Keeping his people united and together, to be sure strictly under his own leadership, became Ross's unwavering goal. And in taking on the treaty party, Ross could point to the vast majority of the Cherokees who supported him in resisting removal. Ross spoke for the many traditionalists among his supporters when he argued that removal would tear the Cherokee people from their ancient and intimate connections to ancestral mountains and streams. A loyal Cherokee, Ross said and insisted, would never trade away the homeland without tribal approval. But this, he claimed, was precisely what the signers of the New Echota Treaty did. After all, Ross argued, the Cherokee people had been despoiled by their guardian, the U.S. government, only to, quote, become strangers and wanderers in the land of their fathers, forced to return to the savage life and to seek a new home in the wilds of the far west, and that without their consent. John Ross was just as acculturated as Elias Boudinot and John Ridge, but he understood and respected traditional Cherokees and refused to pressure them to change their beliefs and way of life. Where Boudinot saw removal as salvation, Ross viewed it as destroying a distinctive traditional Cherokee identity. It is true that most Cherokees did not rally behind the vision of Boudinot and the rest of the treaty party. On the eve of removal, the Cherokee Nation continued to consist mainly of traditionalists who embraced clan governments, subsistence agriculture, shamans, and remained suspicious of the missionaries' Christianity, let alone the white man's civilization. The treaty party's Cherokee Nation, in contrast, envisioned industrious farmers living in nuclear families, formally educated, dedicated to the principles of Christian faith and Republican government. Only a small portion of such a world, in fact, existed in Cherokee country in the 1830s, giving rise to the notion that men like Boudinot and John Ridge were tragic figures who surrendered their lives on behalf of an imaginary nation that did not yet exist. These clashing notions of patriotism that informed much of the war of words in the removal crisis represented fundamentally colliding visions over the future of the Cherokee people. For Ross and his supporters, standing up against an oppressive federal government allied with greedy white settlers in the South was necessarily tied to saving the homeland and preserving the traditional lifeways of the people. But for Boudinot and his friends, such a perspective falsely assumed that Cherokee society was in a sound and prosperous state before the crisis over removal. What distinguished the vision of the treaty party from Ross's party was not simply the choice of saving the people over the land, but the focus as well on what exactly needed saving. Deeply inspired by the missionary spirit, Boudinot and the Ridges believed that the Cherokee people were confronting a moral crisis even more pressing than a political one. So when Ross raged about being despoiled by their guardian, the U.S. government, Boudinot responded by wondering if the Cherokee people themselves were participants in their own degradation. Have we indeed been the instruments of despoiling our nation? Have we destroyed their happiness, checked their civilization, and corrupted their morals? Here Boudinot pointedly contrasted his own moral concerns over the fate of the nation with Ross's pecuniary obsessions. It is with sincere regret, Boudinot addressed Ross, that I notice you say little or nothing about the moral conditions of this people. Instead, Boudinot claimed Ross focused on negotiating the highest price for the lands being surrendered and getting top dollar for the gold mines in Cherokee country. You seem to have forgotten, Boudinot charged, that your people are a community of moral beings. Ross correctly pointed to the suffering of the Cherokee people under the acquisitive and oppressive designs of the U.S. government. But according to Boudinot, he had neglected to consider suffering of a far more important nature, the depression of the mind and the degradation and pollution of the soul. If Ross would but look at the condition of the mass of Cherokees and not simply the more prosperous and hopeful status of those in his inner circle, he would see reason for worry. For Boudinot, the moral condition of the average Cherokee was wretched thanks to the growing problems: intemperance, poverty, and crime. Where the treaty party saw a disturbing moral decline, Ross and his friends found comfort and security in maintaining sacred ties to Cherokee traditions, to the mountains and streams of their homeland that removal would eradicate. For Ross, a good and faithful Cherokee was someone who protected the homeland. Without such a physical touchstone to tribal identity, the very essence of the Cherokee people would be destroyed. However faithfully Ross and his adherents defended these meaningful connections to the land, they paid far less attention to what would happen to the Cherokee people if they were to successfully resist removal and remain in the East. Overrun by white settlers and forced to live as subjects to the laws of Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, Cherokees would soon lose their distinctive identity and assimilation into a white-dominated society. To Boudinot, such a fate was too revolting to think of. In that sense, the treaty party, especially Elias Boudinot and John Ridge, were calling attention to the importance of race and the need for a completely independent Cherokee nation. Thus, remaining in their homeland, where Cherokees would soon be inundated by a demonstrably corrupt and racist white world, would only rivet the chains and fasten the manacles of their servitude and degradation. And such a vision for his people's future, Boudinot believed, led inevitably toward becoming extinct or merged in another race, more ignoble and more detested. May God preserve us from such a destiny. It was, of course, the tenacity of the treaty party, despite the tireless opposition of Ross, that shaped the destiny of the Cherokee Nation in the struggle over removal. Boudinot and the Ridges had no way of knowing that removal would lead to a trail of tears that would cost 4,000 lives and enormous suffering. What they did know was that Georgia settlers were invading their country, evicting people from their homes, stealing property, and violently attacking anyone who resisted. Removal offered an alternative to these depredations, but it also produced the misery and death of the Trail of Tears, which would linger for generations. Elias Boudinot, John Ridge, and Major Ridge paid the ultimate price for their choice to remove. And that choice was a fervently held vision that in the end, the moral as well as physical conditions of their people mattered more than preserving their people's country. Ross lost the battle over removal, but his unflinching commitment to keeping his people together as a unified and sovereign nation remains a powerful legacy of this defining moment in the Cherokee and American past. For the nation at large, the Trail of Tears offers a devastating commentary not only on white greed and power, but also on the increasingly racialized world of Jacksonian America. By the 1830s, only white Americans, especially in the South, could lay claim to citizenship and racial entitlement. Property-owning, well-educated men and women of good character no longer constituted sufficient proof of worthiness for participation in the public realm. One had to be white. In dealing with both African Americans and Native Americans, Andrew Jackson and his Southern supporters practiced a form of racial exclusion that hinged on the belief in the permanent inferiority of all non-whites, black and Indian. Most Northern whites either looked the other way or agreed with their Southern brethren. Elias Boudinot and John Ridge discovered this painful reality behind civilization during their lynching experience at Cornwall. And as the Trail of Tears tragically demonstrates, race remained the key social divide in public life, making much of America a white man's country. Thank you.